On the 3rd of August 1947, large crowds of Soviet people flocked to Tushino airfield to watch the air parade celebrating Soviet Aviation Day. As always, the parade was attended by the Soviet leadership, including Joseph Stalin himself, who was visibly in a good mood. Opening the parade were 3 new Soviet heavy bombers.
Над Тушинским аэродромом проходит машина новейших конструкций. Тяжелые 4-моторные бомбардировщики дальнего действия. Наши летающие крепости.
As excited as the Soviet people were with the spectacle, there was an equal amount of confusion among the foreign visitors because the new Soviet bombers looked exactly like the American Boeing B-29 Superfortress. During World War II, 3 such US bombers crash-landed in the USSR, and the Americans thought that the bombers in the parade were those B-29s only repaired and repainted, as it was simply impossible to believe that the Soviets in such a short time had managed to copy such a technologically complex US bomber. The Americans were wrong, however, as those new bombers were indeed made in the USSR. The new Soviet bomber was the Tupolev Tu-4, and in one thing the Americans were right. It was an exact copy of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. But why would the Soviets, instead of building something new of their own, just bluntly copy the American bomber? And most importantly, how did they do that? As World War II neared its end, Comrade Stalin began to realize perfectly well that the friendly relations between the USSR and its allies in the anti-Hitler coalition were coming to an end, which was kind of expected from the get-go, considering that the Soviets' actions at the dawn of World War II, I mean the annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as parts of Poland, Finland, and Romania, went against the very principles of the United Nations Declaration that the Soviet Union had signed so to get help in the war against Hitler. Yes, the United States and Britain decided to unite with a lesser evil to defeat a greater one, though it is debatable whether it was indeed the lesser evil. But nevertheless, Comrade Stalin believed that the possibility of him being the next in line after Hitler was higher than 0. And that was quite a reasonable expectation, since that was the time when democratic countries had already learned from the brutal examples of Czechoslovakia and Poland a hard lesson that announcing deep concerns alone does not stop dictators. However, the threat wasn't particularly alarming for Stalin, considering that he had the largest land army in the world. This lasted up until August 1945, when the world witnessed the devastating power of atomic weapons, which finally ended World War II and also provided Joseph Stalin with the understanding that now he wouldn't be able to hide behind millions of his soldiers, for now even a single plane carrying a nuclear bomb could be enough to deprive the world of the progressive Soviet leader, and with him the hopes of ever living in a socialist paradise. The solution for Comrade Stalin was quite obvious. He needed his own atomic bomb so that Western countries, if not abandoning their plans entirely, would at least approach the idea of military invasion of the USSR with greater caution. Building an atomic bomb was an enormously difficult and expensive process, challenging even for wealthy and advanced nations like the United States and Britain. But fortunately for Comrade Stalin, the United States and Britain were not only wealthy in resources and scientific talent, but also unfortunately in so-called useful idiots who provided the USSR with secret information on the creation of the atomic bomb. However, as much as it may seem that the hardest part for Stalin was over, just having the bomb without the means to deliver it to enemy territory was in essence useless. Back then, the only available means for that task were strategic bombers, and in this regard, Comrade Stalin was in a very poor situation. The issue was that during the war against Germany, the USSR hadn't focused much on strategic bombing, as there were neither the need nor the capability to do so. There was no need because the systematic destruction of the German military industry was carried out by the Allies, and no capability because Soviet strategic bombers existed only on paper. The Soviets did have a 4-engine heavy bomber, the Petlakov P-8, but by the end of the war its flight characteristics were already outdated. To make matters worse, due to an inherent engineering flaw that couldn't be corrected, the bomber's wings had a tendency to literally break off mid-flight. Meanwhile, in the United States, the task of carrying the A-bomb was carried out by the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, undoubtedly the best heavy bomber of World War II, whose development cost the US more than creating the atomic bomb itself. This was exactly the kind of bomber that Comrade Stalin wanted. However, there was little to no hope of finding any useful idiots in the US Air Force willing to hand over strategic bombers to the USSR. And not that Comrade Stalin didn't try, as can be seen in the official correspondence between the Allied leaders during World War II. It's a bit amusing, by the way, to read through these messages and see how Joseph Stalin heartily thanked the Allies for bombing German cities and even requested that they intensify the bombings as it would help the USSR. Yes, these are the very same bombings of German cities that Russia now blames the Allies for, calling them barbaric and unnecessary. Anyhow, at the very end of 1942, US President Roosevelt had written to Stalin that due to a possible attack by Japan on the USSR, he proposed to preemptively transfer an Air Force unit of 100 4-engine heavy bombers to the USSR. To which Stalin replied, as it called in Russia, plain dumb, "Thank you so much for the 100 bombers, but send them without pilots as we have enough of our own. And we will use the bombers in the West, because in the Far East the USSR is not in a state of war." This, by the way, is a very interesting point that somehow receives little attention when talking about relations between the Allies. Pretty much through all of World War II, Britain and the United States, in addition to fighting Hitler in Europe and Africa, also carried the full burden of the war against the huge empire of Japan. On top of that, all that time they provided their ally, the Soviet Union, with an enormous amount of vital supplies. However, the USSR in turn was not in a hurry to help its allies in the war against Japan. Moreover, during all those years, Japan was freely extracting oil and coal for its own needs in the USSR. I'm referring to the oil and coal concessions in Soviet Sakhalin that were granted to the Empire of Japan in 1925. It wasn't until 1944 that the USSR and Japan signed an agreement to prematurely cancel these concessions, with the USSR paying the Japanese government almost $1 million in compensation. Sorry, my English is not good enough to properly describe this Russian way of treating its allies. One can only imagine how much sooner World War II might have ended if the USSR had allowed the US to deploy its bombardment units in 1942, for example in Vladivostok. This would have enabled US bombers to reach Japan without waiting several years, spending enormous amounts of military resources, and most importantly losing tens of thousands of American, British and other soldiers' lives before capturing the Mariana Islands. It was from there that the B-29 bombers were finally able to reach Japan, which ultimately became one of the decisive moments of World War II. However, even then, the missions for the B-29s were almost at the limit of their flight range, so American bombers damaged during the mission had little chance of returning to American bases and instead headed for the closer Soviet territory for emergency landings. But since the USSR was not at war with Japan, all these American bombers and their crews, who I remind you were direct allies of the USSR, were arrested and placed in internment camps where they were held until the very end of the war. Most importantly, the USSR refused to return the bombers, 3 of which were the most advanced of the time, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. For Comrade Stalin, it was literally a heavenly gift falling from the skies. The Soviets first became aware of the American B-29 program when Eddie Rickenbacker made his trip to the USSR in June 1943. He briefly mentioned a new heavy bomber in development in a friendly conversation with his Russian interpreter, who, what a surprise, was also a Secret Service officer. The Soviets started to gather all available information, and soon in the same year of 1943, the renowned Soviet aircraft engineer Andrei Tupolev was tasked with developing a draft project for a heavy, high-altitude 4-engine bomber. In other words, creating a bomber comparable in performance to the American B-29 aircraft. By August 1944, the aircraft project was ready, and a month later, a full-scale model of the bomber, designated the Aircraft 64, was built and even tested in a wind tunnel. In April 1945, the Aircraft 64 draft was approved by a state commission. On June 5, 1945, Tupolev was summoned to the Kremlin to meet with Joseph Stalin. Tupolev was convinced that the discussion would be about Aircraft 64, so he brought with him a colorful album containing the designs and data about the new bomber. However, it turned out that the album was not needed. There's an amusing legend about this meeting, which is featured in nearly all modern Russian documentaries. Joseph Stalin asked Tupolev what he knew about the Boeing B-29 and his opinion of the aircraft. After hearing Tupolev's thoughts, Stalin informed him of the task to completely copy the American bomber. Tupolev reportedly replied that he could make an even better bomber, to which Stalin retorted, "Don't make it better, just make it the same." On the day after the meeting, the State Defense Committee issued a resolution tasking Tupolev's design bureau with organizing the production of the B-4 aircraft, an exact Soviet copy of the American B-29 bomber. For replicating such a complex machine, Stalin generously allotted Tupolev just 1 year, and 1 more year to build the first 20 bombers so they could take part in the 1947 aviation parade. Many has been written about the process of the Soviets copying the Boeing B-29, but perhaps the most interesting and comprehensive account comes from Leonid Kerber, one of the Andrei Tupolev's deputies who was directly involved in creating the Soviet copy of the American bomber. After the 3 American B-29s that had made emergency landings in the Soviet Far East were flown to Moscow, Tupolev and his team went to the airfield to inspect the Americans. According to Kerber's recollections, Tupolev examined and touched everything he could on the B-29, even attempting to crawl through the tunnel connecting the pressurized cabins. However, being a bit stout, he got stuck. He chuckled and remarked, "This is made for scrawny Americans. They probably don't get enough to eat under capitalism." I have to say, I can't help but point out this amazing joke by Tupolev. Just to remind you that in 1946, when the joke was made, the Soviet Union was already suffering from a horrible famine, which resulted in approximately 2 million Soviet people dying of hunger between 1946 and 1948. And the worst is that the USSR had sufficient grain reserves to save those people, not to mention that it even continued to export grain abroad during those years. Just imagine for a second, 2 million people dead without any war. Just this single episode of the brilliant Soviet leadership caused twice as many deaths as all the Allied casualties in Europe throughout World War II. So a great joke indeed, and the fact that it is constantly depicted in every Russian documentary about Tupolev as funny historical episode only proves that, I agree with Russians when they call themselves a unique God-chosen nation. They are indeed unique, only in a completely opposite sense from what they think. Anyway, after wrapping up the jokes and finishing inspecting the B-29, Andrei Tupolev shared his thoughts that the aircraft design had nothing unique or unfamiliar to him and that building such a machine would not be particularly difficult. However, when Tupolev began to think aloud about the challenges of replicating the aircraft's equipment and armament, any trace of humor disappeared completely. Tupolev decided to completely disassemble one B-29 down to the smallest possible bits, using all its parts to create detailed drawings and then make their exact copies. The second aircraft was to be used for obtaining the bomber's flight specifications and training flight crews. The third B-29 was to be preserved intact as a reference model. Tupolev appointed Dmitry Markov as the chief engineer for the overall project, as noted in Kerber's book, due to Markov's previous experience with the brilliant production launch of the American Vultee V-11 aircraft. This, by the way, is a very interesting point which we will discuss in more detail at the end of the video. So the American aircraft was disassembled into separate structural independent parts, each of which was assigned to an individual engineer with his own team. Each part was then gradually disassembled into smaller parts. In other words, the aircraft was literally gradually disassembled down to the last bolt. All parts were documented, meticulously photographed, weighed, registered, and underwent spectral analysis to determine their material properties. The same principle applied to all wires and tubes connecting those parts. As a result, a huge album of sketches was prepared, which became the basis for further work designing structural elements and developing working drawings. In total, several tens of thousands of working drawings were completed. All the parts obtained after disassembly were then sent to appropriate factories and laboratories for further analysis and copying. Although it was a long and time-consuming process, the hardest part was still ahead. It was determined that the vast majority of technological solutions and materials used in the B-29 were entirely new to Soviet aircraft production. The metal sheets, plates, pressed and bent sections, fasteners, and up to 90% of the materials had never been used or produced by either the aviation or metallurgical industries before. The technological process of aircraft manufacturing and assembly were also new and largely unknown. Indeed, to produce such a bomber, it wasn't just Tupolev's bureau that needed to adapt. All Soviet industries directly or indirectly related to aircraft production had to advance to next level. The involvement of an enormous number of research and production organizations from different industrial sectors, multiplied by the Soviet bureaucracy, became one of the first serious challenges for Tupolev and threatened to significantly slow down, if not completely stop, the overall process of building the new aircraft. One might question Andrei Tupolev's talent specifically as an aircraft engineer, but what was beyond doubt were his excellent skills as a manager, a Soviet manager to be precise, since they could only be effectively applied within the Soviet system. Encountering this problem, Tupolev managed to get the top leadership to ensure that each Soviet ministry would assign special representatives to be responsible for the work on the bomber. And these representatives were appointed at the highest possible level, usually being the deputy ministers or heads of industry departments. This greatly accelerated the process and, to be fair, should be deservedly credited to Tupolev, as otherwise the Soviet bomber would probably never have appeared, or would only have been completed after a huge delay. What is interesting is that these ties built between various Soviet ministries and Tupolev's design bureau continued to exist unofficially even after the completion of work on the Tu-4 bomber, becoming a huge advantage for Tupolev on future projects. According to Kerber's recollections, whenever Tupolev encountered problems with the supply of certain components, equipment, and assemblies for his new aircraft, the issues were usually resolved very quickly thanks to these direct connections, whereas for other design bureaus, this often became a significant problem. However, Tupolev's initiative still did not protect the new Soviet bomber from the so-called Russian mentality of blind execution, which had been honed for decades by Comrade Stalin's effective management in the form of cruel repressions. Every participant in the new bomber's production was acutely aware of Stalin's order to strictly and precisely copy the B-29, with no deviation from the American aircraft allowed in any detail. And as obedient Stalinists, they followed the order exactly, often leading to failures and problems that might seem funny and even ridiculous, if not for the terrifying reality of the Soviet system. For example, the first such incident occurred with the armament. It was obvious from the beginning that all the weapons on the new aircraft should of course be Soviet, which was respectively noted in the aircraft specifications. But knowing that Stalin would not tolerate delays, this specification for the new bomber was hastily prepared and the detailed specification for the armament was not made. So when the matter was addressed more closely, it turned out that behind the armament itself, the bombs and machine guns, there was also quite a long trail of other parts and details, like bomb locks, bomb release mechanism, turret rotation motors, ammunition belts and boxes, you name it. Even the targeting sights needed to be different from those on the B-29, as the ballistics of American and Soviet bombs and bullets were not the same. Anywhere else but the Soviet Union, such problem might not even exist. However, in this case, quiet discussions began regarding those smaller details. So, are we copying the Boeing or not? Remembering Stalin's strict order for every minor deviation from the original assignment, each participant in the process began now to demand a signed document releasing them from responsibility. But issuing such a document would also mean a deviation from the assignment, and no one wanted to take that risk either. The entire process was quickly heading toward a dead end. As Kerber recalled, eventually a new foundational document was issued with a large number of big signatures from various ministries and departments. However, all this was resolved so terribly slowly, with awful nerve-wracking delays, and most importantly, it was hindering the release of the drawings. But after solving one problem, another arose, this time with the IFF system. It seemed obvious that the new Soviet bomber should be equipped with the Soviet system, already adopted by the Red Army. However, since this was not specified in the main document, the radio technology industry produced equipment for the new bomber that was a direct copy of the American IFF system. And that system was the one installed on the first aircraft. The potential consequences were easy to imagine. If a Soviet fighter equipped with a Soviet IFF system encountered a Tu-4 bomber with the American IFF system and did not receive a proper friend or foe response, the fighter would very likely open fire on the bomber immediately. Couldn't this have been foreseen? It could have been, and it was, of course. But as Kerber wrote in his book, the fear overcame everything, including common sense, and the only consideration left was that leadership knows best. Another amusing example was the parachutes. The American B-29 crew had their parachutes in backpacks, which served as a sort of soft backrest for their seat while on board the plane. Meanwhile, the Soviet Air Force were still using the so-called seat parachutes, which served as a cushion that the pilot sits on. That's why the seats in all Russian aircraft were made cup-shaped, so to accommodate these seat parachutes. And so, once again, the Soviet engineers faced the question, if we copy flat seats from the B-29, should we then introduce special backpack parachutes for the new bomber, a copy of the American ones? As Kerber recalled, everyone agreed that doing that would be stupid, and yet when it came to real actions, everyone demanded signed documents to make this simple change in seats. As Kerber said, no one wanted to end up in Siberia. Everyone knew that some honest Soviet citizen would inevitably report that his co-worker was violating Comrade Stalin's order. A similarly ridiculous situation occurred with the bomber's radio receiver. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union had been receiving various American aircraft, including B-25 bombers, which by 1945 were equipped with more advanced radio receivers compared to those found on the B-29s that had crashed a year earlier. It seemed obvious that the new Soviet bomber should be equipped with these newer, more advanced radio receivers. The deputy minister of the Soviet electronics industry, Ivan Zubovich, fully agreed with Tupolev's engineers in that regard, but refused to proceed without official approval from the Air Force. Meanwhile, the Air Force representative, the renowned General Sergei Danilin, responded, "Absolutely, this new radio receiver is exactly what we need, but I cannot give my official consent." As Kerber noted in his book, after nearly 3 years of close interactions with numerous ministries and industry departments, he observed that the vast majority of Soviet workers on every level fell into the category of so-called blunt executors. Constrained by the strict order to copy the American bomber, they preferred simply to do their work and not to worry about the various problems that arose, even when those issues appeared to be important, if not critical, to the overall success of the project. Aside from the problem of blunt execution, there was another significant issue of a totally different kind: the measurement units. As you know, the US uses the imperial system, while the Soviet Union uses the metric system. I have to say, this is probably the only area where the USSR was much better than the United States. Sorry, my American friends. Anyway, the difference in units became a huge headache for Tupolev's engineers and the Soviet industry's capabilities. For example, they determined that the thickness of the B-29 skin was 1/16 of an inch, which, when converted to the metric system, equals to 1.5875 mm. But no Soviet factory could roll metal sheets with a precision to thousandths of millimeters, so the engineers had to round it. However, if they rounded the number up to the nearest possible standard of 1.6 mm, then the aerodynamic engineers started to protest, as that would lead to a weight increase and thus they couldn't guarantee the required aircraft speed, altitude and range characteristics. On the other hand, when rounding down to 1.5 mm, then the structural engineers objected, as they couldn't guarantee the strength characteristics. The issue was resolved in a Soviet engineering matter. Depending on the calculated load on each particular part of the bomber, they either increased the thickness of the skin or made it thinner. As a result, the Tu-4 fuselage thickness in different places ranged from 0.8 to 1.8 mm. There were also difficulties that seemed small, yet according to Kerber still managed to slow down the work. The American bomber came with a pile of various manuals and instructions that obviously had to be translated into Russian for Soviet airmen to use. The problem was that the aircraft engineers didn't know English, which is why translators were brought in. However, although these translators spoke English perfectly well, they had little to no understanding of engineering and aviation concepts. As a result, as Kerber noted, the engineers had to spend their evenings after work editing these translations. He also mentioned that they couldn't help but admire how the American authors of the manuals conveyed information to the readers concisely and comprehensively, while Soviet bureaucratic language, as he put it, laid like logs blocking the road. For example, one of the pre-flight checks in the manual said, "Start the putt-putt." As Kerber noted, they spent an enormous amount of time going through all available books, dictionaries and encyclopedias trying to find out what that putt-putt was, but found no answer. It was only when the very first Soviet bomber was built and they were getting it ready for flight that they figured it out. When they started an auxiliary power unit, it made the sound put-put-put-put, so what was in the manual was simply an imitation of the engine's exhaust sound. But the Soviet manual, as Kerber joked, was no place for childish names, and what was clearly explained in the American manual in just one sentence, in the Russian manual turned into… Sorry, I'm not sure I can properly read it. But despite the slowdowns and setbacks, the work continued and eventually all the drawings and preparations were completed. The aircraft construction phase finally began. However, tensions were only growing as Stalin's deadlines crept closer and closer. Stress reached its peak when the aircraft was finally built at the Kazan aviation factory. There is a well-known case when the deputy director of the Kazan factory, Leonid Baklunov, refused to sign the documents authorizing the first flight test, believing that the aircraft was still not ready. Unable to withstand the immense pressure from his superiors, Baklunov tragically took his own life. In the HR department, there is still a record about Leonid Baklunov saying dismissed on April 19th due to death. But, of course, such trivial matters could not stop the execution of Stalin's order, and on May 19, 1947, test pilot Nikolai Rybko took the new bomber into the air. To everyone's relief, the first flight was successful and didn't reveal any serious problems. However, you can't say that the fears about the plane's readiness were entirely unfounded. There is an interesting description in that regard made by the famous Soviet test pilot Mark Galay, who took part in the test flights of the very first Tupolev Tu-4s. In his book, he mentioned his conversation with Rybko after his first flight on the Tu-4, and I like how he answered the question about the aircraft equipment. "Can you imagine, it seems to work," said Rybko. "At least those pieces that we have turned on so far." "That's encouraging," replied Galay, and I can't really say whether he was expressing his true feelings or subtle sarcasm. Right after the first Tu-4 bomber was built, the second and then the third quickly followed. All three bombers were set to participate in the 1947 air parade in Moscow, where they would be demonstrated to Western observers for the very first time. Both Mark Galay and Leonid Kerber described in their books a funny episode that occurred on their way to Moscow. As they recall, they took off normally, but all of a sudden hot air started to pump into the cockpit. Mark Galay realized that after a few flights on the Tu-4, they had only learned the aircraft's primary control systems and he had no idea how the air conditioning worked. Fortunately for him, Leonid Kerber, a lead engineer from Tupolev's bureau who had designed and built this very plane, was on board, so Galai asked him to turn off the heat. However, it turned out that Kerber also had no knowledge of the air conditioning controls. He spent a lot of time searching for them, but alas, without success. As a result, as he recalled, by the time they were approaching Moscow, everyone on board had stripped down like sunbathers on the sandy beaches of Sochi. Interestingly, the Soviets decided not to bother with using the first completed bombers as prototypes to verify all system performances, as one would typically do when developing brand new aircraft. Instead, they immediately started serial production of a new aircraft. In some ways, this decision was justified, as the Soviet plane was an exact copy of an American bomber that had already been used successfully for several years. However, it was still a newly built aircraft and not everything went smoothly. Shortly after the air parade, the third bomber produced was lost due to engine fire. Of course, there were multiple issues, but the aircraft engines perhaps caused the most trouble, being unprecedentedly technologically complex. Here it's worth noting an important detail. The Asha-73 engines installed on the Soviet bomber was a Soviet design and not a copy of the ones from the B-29. Any similarities between the engines were because the Soviet and American engines had a common ancestor. Both of them were a further development of the American Wright Cyclone engine, which the Soviets had previously purchased under a license from the US and produced under the designation M25. In other words, Stalin was aware of the proper approach to purchasing a license rather than blatantly stealing technologies. Speaking of Stalin, it was he who in 1947 signed the Completion Act for the state tests of the new bomber, which was the only such case in the history of Soviet aviation. And it was while signing this act that Stalin personally corrected the bomber's original designation of B-4 to Tu-4, thereby acknowledging Andrei Tupolev's contributions in completing this difficult task. The aircraft was then launched into mass production and sent to the Air Force heavy bombardment units. In total, about 1,000 copies of the aircraft were built. On October 18, 1951, the Tu-4 bomber dropped the first Soviet atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsky test site. Stalin's goal was finally achieved. Although capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, the Soviet Tupolev Tu-4 never became a real threat to the United States, as its flight range was still insufficient to reach US territory. However, despite this, the Tu-4 held enormous significance for the USSR. As stated in all Russian books, articles, documentaries, and of course on Wikipedia, the development of serial production of the Tu-4 bomber enabled Soviet heavy aircraft manufacturing to transition to a new, more technologically advanced level in the shortest possible time. And here the most interesting question arises: how? How could a country that was so far behind the United States in terms of aviation, weaponry, electronics, and other technologies manage to create such a complex aircraft? If you are Russian, the answer to this question is very simple. Everything was done thanks to the wise, strong-willed decision of the great comrade Stalin, followed by an unmatched feat of labor by the Russian people, which once again proved that there is nothing impossible for this greatest nation of all. And for the Russian audience, such an explanation of yet another myth of Russian greatness is enough. And not surprising, of course. As the expression goes, life is easier when you are Russian. So what made the Tu-4 bomber possible then? Was Stalin's wise order and the availability of the American bomber to copy from really all that was needed? The short answer is, of course, no. And you don't need to take my word for it. Let's get back to Dmitry Markov, who, as noted in Kerber's book, was appointed chief engineer of the Tu-4 bomber project because of his previous experience overseeing the implementation of the American Vultee aircraft into production. And according to Kerber, Markov did not just simply make it, but he made it brilliantly. The Soviet Union in 1936 did indeed purchase a license to produce the American Vultee V-11, which in the USSR received the designation Basha-1. And the reason you have probably never heard of it is because of how brilliantly the Basha-1 was implemented into production. When the Soviets bought the license to the Vultee V-11, by American standards it was already far from being an advanced aircraft. To be fair though, the Russians understood this perfectly well, and their main reason for purchasing it was not to get a new plane, but to master the new aircraft manufacturing technology. But it turned out that implementing even such an outdated aircraft into production was beyond the Soviets' capabilities. The Soviet-built planes appeared much heavier, less powerful, and on top of that with many defects, such as, for example, failure to retract landing gear or stuck bomb locks. And the phrase Soviet-built would also be quite an exaggeration, since the first 5 Basha-1s were not even built, but essentially assembled from parts supplied by Valty company. In other words, the Russians couldn't even properly assemble aircraft from parts made in America. Of course, this failure was not Dmitry Markov's fault alone, although it didn't save him from arrest in 1938 for sabotage and espionage. And it is in prison where he started working with Andrei Tupolev, along with other imprisoned engineers. As we can see from the Basha-1 example, the purchased production technology along with actual planes and parts, coupled with the wise order of Comrade Stalin, were not enough to copy the American plane. So then, how did pretty much the same people in just a few years manage to reorganize not only their own construction bureau, but the whole Soviet industry so to produce an incomparably more complex aircraft? What was the USSR missing in the late 1930s that in 1945 made possible such a powerful leap forward in Soviet technologies and production? The short answer is the Germans. As you probably know, after World War II ended, Germany, in order to compensate for the damage they inflicted, was obliged to pay war reparations to the Allied countries, including, of course, the USSR. The reparations were paid in various forms, such as currencies, precious metals and resources, as well as the dismantling and transfer of industrial objects. Indeed, the Soviet Union was not the only one doing that. However, it was the only one doing it to such extent. During only 1 year from 1945 to 1946, before the war reparations were actually legalized by the Potsdam Conference, the USSR had already dismantled and transported to its territory more than 4,000 various industrial objects. Another significant part of the reparations that modern-day Russia somehow remained silent about was forced labor provided by the German population. In total, more than 500,000 German civilians were deported from Germany and Eastern Europe to the USSR after World War II as forced laborers. But in the context of this video, more interesting is the so-called Operation Os-Aviahim, a secret Soviet operation on October 22, 1946, under which more than 2,500 German scientists, engineers and technicians, together with their family members, totaling more than 6,000 people, were transported from Germany to the Soviet Union. Upon arrival in the socialist paradise, the majority of German engineers were assigned to the Soviet Ministry of Aviation, developing planes as well as jet engines. The rest of the specialists were distributed among other industries such as armament production, radar and telecommunications, chemical industry. All those industries where coincidentally a year later the great Russian people would achieve an unprecedented technological leap forward while executing Stalin's task of replicating the American B-29 bomber. So the reality is it was not Stalin with his strong will and wise decisions, and certainly not the great Russian people, but rather the German engineers, often placed in supervisory positions over their Russian employees, who made possible that enormous leap of Soviet industry. The process of replicating the B-29 wasn't what started the rapid industry development, but was rather the first serious task to check the capabilities of the newly upgraded Soviet industry and its personnel previously delivered to the USSR from defeated Germany. And I know there will be a few mentally gifted viewers who will rush to the comments to say, but the Americans did the same. I know, they did. And the fact that you know that is precisely the difference between the free world and Russia. You see, Werner von Braun was presenting his rocket and space ideas on national TV as early as the 1950s and was openly recognized as the creator of the original German V-2 and American rockets that followed. Meanwhile, in Russia, even 70 years later, they still believe that all their scientific achievements are the result of sudden enlightenment and heroic feats of labor. You see, I'm not judging here the fact that the Soviets used German brains and labor in building their war machine. It was rough, evil, but nevertheless normal logic, so to say, of the country's war industry. The danger lies in drawing the wrong conclusions and misinterpreting such events. Unlike what you might think, the story of copying the American bomber is not a story kept secret in Russia. Quite the opposite, it is widely told, although always presented as a unique example of the technological achievements made possible due to the uniqueness of the Russian people, serving as yet another brick in the myth of Russian greatness. For decades, this self-deceptive myth has slowly grown, though it has largely remained confined within the borders of the so-called Russian world, as Western civilization has always been resilient to these ridiculous stories from the Russians, which sadly is not the case anymore. When, let's not name names, an influential American with a huge audience talks to the media about Russians and says that they defeated Hitler, they defeated Napoleon, they are a war machine, it is a frightening display of how these myths have taken hold. You see, this statement, Russians defeated Napoleon, exists exclusively in the Russian historical universe, the same universe that claims a rapidly advanced Soviet industry created a copy of the American B-29 bomber. For the rest of the world, Napoleon fought against a coalition of countries, with Russia being just one of its members, and the 1812 invasion of Russia was just one episode of the Napoleonic Wars. Moreover, at the epic 1815 Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon suffered his final defeat and which indeed marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Russians were not even present. As for the claim of defeating Hitler alone, when Vladimir Putin made such a statement during the Victory Day parade in 2021, it was widely regarded as complete nonsense from a delusional dictator. And it is terrifying that just 3 years later this statement is being repeated by someone who aspires to lead the land of the free. Interestingly, the myth of Russian greatness is so powerful that sometimes even Russian leaders fall victim to it. Take, for example, Nikita Khrushchev, who falsely believed in the capabilities of his nuclear submarines missile systems, a misconception that some believe may have influenced his decision to back off during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ironically, the source of his false belief was none other than Khrushchev's own commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, Sergei Gorshkov. If you want to learn more about this fascinating episode, check out my video available exclusively on my streaming service Nebula. And if you're really into the history of the Soviet Union, you can explore my other videos as well, like the story of the so-called recoilless madness of the 1930s, when the Soviets attempted to arm their fighters with absurdly large guns, or the amusing story of the Soviet MiG-21 that accidentally landed on a NATO airfield, or the ghost flight story when an Antonov An-12 circled over a city for several hours with an entirely unconscious crew. I know I talk about Nebula all the time because Nebula isn't like other streaming platforms. It was founded and is owned directly by us, the creators. Nebula is genuinely the most sustainable way to support content creators. When you sign up with my link nebula.tv/paperskies, I will get a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed. But you will also get access to everything the platform has to offer, not just my videos. Nebula houses dozens of unique exclusive projects like Red Atoms by Real Time History, Underexposure by Neo, and Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, along with many more projects which otherwise wouldn't be possible since it's too risky to produce them for YouTube due to strict advertiser policies. On Nebula, we don't need to worry about that, simply because there are no ads or sponsorship messages there, which is why the number of such exclusive videos is growing every day. You can get access to Nebula with my link in the description, which gives Paper Skies fans an amazing 40% off an annual subscription, bringing the cost down to just $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. You can also now give Nebula as a gift with annual gift cards. Sign up using my link nebula.tv/paperskies to get 40% off an annual subscription and support my channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching.